Hello, everybody. What's good? I hope you're doing well. Sorry for the lack of uploads. I'll be consistent again soon, but second time moving in 3 months. Now, the other day, this video is about 5 days old. It'll be 6 days old when I upload this video. But DistroTube made a video called The Age of Beginner-Friendly Distributions is Over. Now, I will say I respect DistroTube a lot as a content creator. If you haven't checked him out, he has a lot of good videos, especially on different utilities for Linux and different distributions, things like that. So I do want to give a shout out to DistroTube, but I disagree with his take in this video, and I thought that it would make an interesting discussion. So with this topic, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, if you agree with me here, or if you agree with DistroTube here, or have your own opinion. So let's just jump into it.
Their boomer backyard vlog. I'm doing some yard work today because, I got to thinking, I've been making videos about Linux for about 10 years now, right? I've been on YouTube making Linux content for about 10 years, and I got to thinking how things have changed. The kind of content I made 10 years ago is not content I would make today, and the reason is the kind of content I made 10 years ago wouldn't be appropriate for today's Linux world because, man, so many things are different. When I first started making videos about Linux, the big topic was just getting new users to Linux, getting new users the ability to install and use some of these distributions. It's, hey, some of these distributions are for more advanced users. Not every distribution is for a beginner. Which distributions are for a beginner?
Now, interestingly, I've also been in the Linux space for a while. So for those who haven't been following me for a long time, I'm about to turn 21, so I've been making Linux content for almost 8 years now. I do not recommend watching these old videos because they're trash. I'm about to turn 21, and I think I was like 12 or 13 when I started making these videos. I've personally came a long way, but I've also seen Linux grow throughout the last 8 years. And I actually think that in certain ways, Linux has actually regressed as a beginner-friendly experience. Yes, we've gotten Proton, and Proton's been awesome, because when I first started using Linux, Proton didn't exist. I remember the day that came out, that was like the most exciting piece of Linux news I've ever seen. I still don't remember a piece of Linux news that big. Maybe GNOME 40 and the Steam Deck? I don't know. So things like that have definitely made Linux a better experience for beginners. However, we're also in the middle of the Wayland transition where there's display servers, X11's the old de facto standard, Wayland's the new one. And back when I first started Linux, very few distributions defaulting to Wayland. And so you could just install a distro and it's going to have X11 and everything's going to work on X11 unless you have high DPI displays or something. Nowadays, we're at the tail end of the transition where most distributions are going to be shipping Wayland by default unless they ship a desktop like maybe XFCE. Something like that. But the problem is Wayland still doesn't have feature parity with X11. If you want easy, unattended remote desktop on Wayland and you don't want to use the official GNOME solution, good luck. And I'm also going to go a little bit more in depth in a second when DistroTube mentions Ubuntu, but I think Ubuntu has also regressed as a beginner-friendly distro, and I'll show why later in this video.
And the ones that are for a beginner, even some of those required some tutorials, some talk through to get you through the installation process. But that is not the case nowadays.
I don't really know why he's talking about the installation process then versus now, because when I first started using Linux 8 years ago, yes, you had Arch, which didn't have a installer back then, and even the installer now is still terminal based. Since I've been using Linux, pretty much every distribution has just been you boot off a live USB and install it and it's ready to go, and that hasn't changed within the last 8 years since I've been using Linux. So I don't know why he's talking about that like it's a brand new thing, but let's continue.
10 years ago, certainly 15, 20 years ago, we talk about distributions that were beginner-friendly distributions. Distributions like Linux Mint, right? Linux Mint used to be the one everybody recommended for beginners.
I still think Linux Mint is probably the best recommendation for beginners. Honestly, the only reason I can't run Linux Mint on, let's say, my mom's computer, which is going to be the go-to example I'm going to be using for the points I'm making in this video, is I think that package managers are a ticking time bomb and a liability. They're great for power users, but eventually you're going to run into some dependency conflict or something. The only way you aren't going to do that is if you're running only packages that will never be removed from the repository, so nothing old or obscure, and you don't run PPAs or any external repositories. And that's just for fixed distributions. If it's for a rolling distribution, it's even more of a liability, because if you're on a fixed distribution, the only real maintenance you have to do other than just updating your system for security updates is that massive update when they go from like a Linux Mint 22 to a 23. And you have to do all of the fixes you need to do during that transition. Whereas with a rolling release distribution, there's no window for them to move a breaking change to the next version of a distro, so you got to handle that as it comes in, which is especially a problem if you're a GNOME user and you get an Arch Linux update with the newest version of GNOME, and all of a sudden all your extensions are broken. Have fun with that.
If you were a beginner, just go install Linux Mint. Or Ubuntu, which Linux Mint is based off of. That was the one, especially 20 years ago. Hey, go install that, because it was one of the few distributions that came with a nice graphical installer that was very easy to use. Anybody could get Ubuntu installed. Well, things are a lot different now.
So I will say most distributions now, nearly anybody could get installed. I'm not going to say anybody because my mom would not be able to install Linux, but if you have some technical merit at all, you could do that. But I do think Ubuntu has regressed as a beginner-friendly option, specifically because of the Snap Store. I'm not one of those YouTubers trying to push an anti-Snap agenda to you. Like, if we're talking about my mom running Ubuntu, she just wants to be able to open up an app store, and it doesn't matter if it's a Snap or a Flatpak or a native package, as long as she can click install and then a couple minutes later have a usable program on her computer, that's fine. My problem with the Snap Store is just the overall user experience on Ubuntu. So you open it up, it gives you an Explore tab. All of these are Snap packages, which, like I said, I don't have a problem with by itself, but bear with me for a second. And it recommends you like KDE apps, which Ubuntu ships GNOME, so that's stupid. But then every time you search an app, let's say LibreOffice, it's going to give you separate views for both Snap and Debian packages. And it's going to default to the Snap package. You're not able to just show both. And so brand new Linux beginners are either just not going to even know that there's a difference and just always go with the Snap, which in a second I'll show you why that's a bad idea, or they have to actually go in and research the difference between a Snap and a Debian package. Now again, I don't think this would be a big deal, except if we go to the Snap Store right here, I'm just going to type GNOME and find a random GNOME app. I'm just going to do the first one, System Monitor. This is a package maintained by Canonical, so this isn't some random maintainer who just hasn't had time to come back to this package and keep it up to date. This is the people who make Ubuntu, Canonical. The current version they ship of GNOME System Monitor is version 48. Not only are we on GNOME 50, but if we go to packages.org right here, it lets you track different versions of packages certain distros have. And if we go to Ubuntu 2604 LTS, the latest version, boom, we have a newer version right here, GNOME System Monitor 49. Let's find a different GNOME app. Let's try GNOME Calendar. Okay, this wasn't even planned. This is an even more ancient version. This is running GNOME Calendar 44 from June 2023 for the stable branch. This version of the GNOME Calendar is over 3 years old now. Again, this is a Canonical maintained package. And again, if we go to Ubuntu 2604 LTS, GNOME Calendar 50 right here. Actually, if we go to the last LTS to 2404, that's a newer version as well. Now, in my video talking about this, the Ubuntu App Center is a complete joke. I was getting comments saying, Ubuntu's an LTS, the software's supposed to be old. Well then tell me, why does the second most recent LTS still have a newer version than the Snap package, which is supposed to be a universal package shipped out everywhere? And so, philosophy differences aside, performance differences aside, even just that one thing alone makes Ubuntu a bad recommendation for beginners for me, because they're going to have to know the difference between a deb package and a snap package. And if they just go with what Ubuntu recommends, which is a snap package, they're going to be installing stuff that's years old. Anyways, let's continue.
In 2026, there's no such thing as a beginner-friendly distribution anymore. I don't think they exist. I think every single Linux distribution, everything that's a mainstream desktop Linux distribution, they're all beginner-friendly now. They all come with graphical installers, right? For the most part. You know, 99% of them come with graphical installers that are very easy to install, even for somebody brand new to Linux. Now, most of them come with built-in graphical desktop environments, pre-configured. You know, it's a different world. Like if, you know, I was the creator of Linux Mint, you know, how I created Linux Mint 20 years ago was, hey, I wanted to be a beginner-friendly distribution. I think now you got to change focus. I think now you got to be more than just a beginner-friendly distribution, because everything's a beginner-friendly distribution.
Okay, I disagree with some points of this and do agree with other points. So nowadays, if I'm just going to go on Distro Watch real quick, and let's go to the ranking. Pretty much every single one of these, except for maybe Arch, Void, NixOS, the BSDs, and some of the more specialized operating systems like Puppy Linux. Probably, let's say 75% of these distributions here. Easy installation on almost any piece of hardware. Graphical, you get a pre-installed desktop environment, you get an easy software center. So in terms of the installation experience and just getting going, anyone can install almost any of those distributions. Now, what turns it from just a regular distribution to a beginner-friendly distribution to me is the can I install it on my mom's computer test. And most of these distributions don't pass that. I would say Ubuntu, if they fix the experience for the Snap Store, as well as Mint and Zorin OS, distributions that would pass the mom test, up until I have to upgrade the next release for my mom. And I also think some of the Atomic distributions, like the Universal Blue family and my distribution here, sorry for the plug, but StillOS, those would also pass the mom test as long as their hardware works out of the box. Because some of the Atomic distros, if you have obscure or weird hardware, good luck running them on Atomic distributions where you can't just install a package to fix it. So that's still a very limited subset of distributions I'd be able to recommend to my mom. And he's going to list off many more distributions in his video. So as he lists them off, I'm going to go into what makes them bad for the mom test. I will say, if you actually want to learn Linux, pretty much any distribution is fine. You will have to do some research along the way. But if you're someone who's just fed up with Windows and want a Linux system ready to go, there's still a very limited set of options, in my opinion.
Arch Linux is a beginner-friendly distribution these days. It doesn't come with a graphical installer, but even the command line installation is not hard. Now they...
Okay, I think he is rage baiting with this one. There's no way he thinks Arch Linux is a beginner-friendly distribution. He might just be talking about the derivatives, but I will never recommend a rolling release to a beginner. Going back to the maintenance window thing, there's no way for a rolling release distribution to be able to sort of delay a breaking change to the distribution, which makes it so you have to maintain it more manually.
Have their little ncurses or Python based curses kind of installation program, which is very easy to use. So and then you've got all the Arch based distros, Cashy and Endeavor and Zero Linux and all of that stuff. Very new user friendly.
Kind of. So yeah, I do think that the Arch derivatives are better than base Arch, with a key exception Manjaro, because I'll talk about that in a second. But I haven't ever actually used CachyOS or Zero Linux, which he's mentioned, but I'll use Endeavor as the example in my head here. Endeavor OS, you get an easy Arch installation with whatever desktop, and you have all these different tools to manage your installation, but it's still not like fully set and forget. You still have to use these tools that the system gives you to actually maintain your system. And then again, you're on a rolling release distro, especially if you're on a GNOME desktop, that may come over to bite you with the extra maintenance burden it adds. And then Manjaro specifically, Manjaro holds back packages, but then also gives you very easy access to the AUR. And these AUR packages are made for vanilla art. And I've ran into breakages on Manjaro multiple times that are all caused by the AUR. And it's not just Manjaro that happens. The AUR can just straight up break your Arch system if you use it the wrong way and you don't vet the packages you are installing, which means you need to actually vet the packages you're installing even more than you did before. And some of these Arch distributions give you just way too easy access to the AUR, when I think the AUR should be a tool for advanced users.
Then you've got your Atomic distros that are supposed to be, quote, unbreakable. You got things based on Silverblue. You got things like Bazzite, Aurora, and all of that stuff out there.
Like I said, pretty much the only problem is if your hardware doesn't work straight out of the box, it is harder to actually fix it than it would be on a traditional distro. And some applications like VirtualBox or DaVinci Resolve can be a pain on Atomic distros, but other than that, it is just a general way better day-to-day experience because it's easy set and forget. So I would agree with him there, but that still is a distinction between a normal distribution and a beginner-friendly Atomic one.
I think just mainline Fedora these days is pretty stable and beginner friendly. I remember years ago when I was kind of new to desktop Linux, Fedora, more bleeding edge, you know, you could experience some breakages. I think these days Fedora is rock solid.
I disagree with that. Don't get me wrong, Fedora is actually my favorite distribution that isn't my own, stillOS. I love Fedora. However, Fedora has a lot of post-installation steps that you may need to do after actually installing Fedora, especially like RPM Fusion. If you actually want to be able to properly play video files on your computer, you need to install RPM Fusion and then install a bunch of different non-free codecs to actually get that working, and Fedora doesn't make that obvious. You have to actually know to go and do that, which Fedora doesn't handhold you to do.
Still got your Ubuntus and Mints out there. They're still rock solid. I just don't think, I think we're past the point of needing to separate some of these Linux distributions into beginner friendly versus, you know, the more expert mode distributions. I think the lines have been blurred. I think a lot of that has to do with, again, ease of installation. I also think ease of installation of programs. I think some of our package formats, especially things like snaps and flatpaks and app images, have made a lot of these distributions more on a level playing field.
I do agree with that. You no longer need a distribution of a big repo anymore. You can easily get away with a much smaller repository like a Solus Linux, for example, and then just supplement it with Flatpaks.
Back in the day, it was all about whose repositories of software had the most software, right? And it was Debian and Arch, right? That was your go-to. That's why they're so popular. But these days, you know, with all these distro agnostic package formats, you can get practically anything you want installed on any distribution. And that's, you know, before you even get into stuff like Docker, right? Which makes a distro box and stuff like that.
Okay, but like someone like my mom or even a Linux beginner isn't going to be jumping straight into Docker or DistroBox. That does require a level of technical know-how involving Linux that just a straight beginner or even a non-technical person will not have.
So, you know, it's a different world now. You know, the purpose for me doing Linux videos 10 years ago, it's not the same now. You guys don't need that kind of content now. The content where I show a beginner, you know, how to go install Linux, because these days pretty much pick a Linux distribution. I bet you can figure out how to install it. And even if you can't, I know people hate it when I bring this up, but the world of AI has changed everything.
I do agree with him on this, but I am going to skip this part because this isn't that relevant to this discussion I'm trying to have here. I will probably do a completely separate video on this topic, but he goes into just how you can easily solve any Linux issue now just by asking ChatGPT. And you can even have AI like write scripts for you and things like that, which is a valid use case of AI.
I think we're past the point of needing, quote, beginner friendly distributions. I think these desktop Linux distributions now need to do other things to differentiate themselves.
Okay, I do agree that there isn't that much differentiation anymore, but I also disagree that there aren't things to work on that can make Linux better for beginners. Now, I'm sorry to be plugging my project stillOS again. I'm genuinely not trying to make this video an ad, but this is the goal of stillOS, is to make the first Linux distribution that truly passes the mom's computer test for me. And there are a lot of things that we are able to do to actually make it better for beginners, specifically with a lot of hand-holding and things like that. Now, the first boot experience, it will auto-install drivers for you, start a system update, and then let you pick your browser. And then it also gives you a curated selection of apps that you may need for your work. Another thing stillOS tries to address is the app compatibility problem. A lot of people in the real world need Office, and so we have a web runtime called SWI, and this lets us turn web applications like Word Online, for example. Boom, here's a web wrapper around Microsoft Word Online that feels like a desktop native app. And I could give my mom this, and she probably would not notice the difference between regular Word and this web version, other than maybe how files save. And then finally, stillOS ships a GNOME-based desktop environment, and there are a lot of, let's say, KDE apps or even old GDK2 apps, things like that, that do not work very well in a modern GNOME Wayland desktop. And so KDE apps and Qt apps are a huge example of this. We have a little still rating in our software center where most of the apps in the store are tested and given a rating on how well they work on stillOS. So Qt apps, for example, notoriously do not look good on GNOME, which is an entirely different problem in its own. But right here, we can see what the problems are going to be. Qt interface is broken dark mode, blurry title bars. And then if I go to like a libid Weta app, boom, Gold Plus works perfect. So these are just the things I've already shipped. I have a lot of ideas that I'm going to develop in the future to try and improve the experience for, let's say, my mom, and be able to hold people's hand throughout their Linux experience. And I think these are the types of innovations that beginner-friendly distributions need to actually focus on, rather than just an easy installation experience. And even if all your drivers and codecs and everything are already configured out of the box, and even if you have auto updates, things like that, there's still a lot of potential ways that people can go and end up fucking up their computer. And I think things like atomic distributions and some of the things stillOS tries to do, the whole goal here is to help handhold the user even after the installation throughout their use of the computer. Now, this may not be something a power user would want, but if you were trying to recommend Linux to a normal person who knows nothing about computers and doesn't want to deal with it, they just want a working computer, these are the type of things that Linux distributions need to start focusing on more. Thank you to DistroTube for the original video. I know I disagreed with most of his takes, but it did give me a good opportunity to discuss some of the problems I think Linux has for beginners. So huge shout out to DistroTube. What do you guys think about this topic? Let me know in the comment section below. If you are new to Linux, check out my ultimate guide right here. This will tell you everything you may need to know to get going. And a subscription would also be really helpful with all of that. I hope you learned something. Peace out.